All right. Well, I think that we are set to go. Want to be respectful of everyone's time. Just wanted to formally say welcome. Thank you all first and foremost for being here today. I think dedicating time for some of you, it's 4, 3, 2 o'clock, depending upon your time zone. But we very much so you dedicating time, especially on a Thursday. For many of you, probably right after or near the end of a school day. But we very much appreciate, want to make the most of this time you have and we have with you today. So our session today is called Building Belonging, how to leverage digital tools and in-person interactions to cultivate an inclusive community. One of the things that we at Screencastify and our Friends of Modern Classroom project have consistently thought about is ways that we can cultivate and encourage learning in really any way that's going to help teachers and students. And so digital tools has been something, as we all know, that has increased both in capacity and frequency over the last few years. And now it's really, I think, about kind of looking back in reflection in terms of what we can learn from the past, thinking about the future and how to kind of capitalize on both the momentum and lessons that we have learned to encourage belonging in a variety of different ways. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We will do a couple quick intros. I will start. My name is Shaun Conway. I am the Vice President of Customer Success here at Screencastify. Thank you again to those of you that are with us. Prior to coming to Screencastify, I was a high school teacher, department chair, and assistant principal for about 10 years. And I think that has significantly framed whenever we approach sessions like we have today, where educators are dedicating 30, 45, 60 minutes with us. That means a lot. And we know that it is a very significant give on your part. So we want to be kind of as tangible and practical as possible, which is why I think my guest and co-host, Matt Hickson, is the perfect person to join us today. But Matt, I'll throw it over to you for a quick intro from your side.
Thanks, Shaun. Yeah, Shaun actually knew me in my previous role, which I'll talk about in just a second. I was a principal, a district director for online and blended learning. Most of that happened in Durham Public Schools. I worked there for a bit over a decade. That's in Central North Carolina. I am now the head of partner transformation for our team at Modern Classrooms Project. In that role, I get to work with dozens of school leaders and districts across the country that are really doing some of the most innovative things with mastery-based, self-paced, and blended learning practices, leveraging some of those digital tools that you're talking about, but also really thinking about mastery-based learning and how it plays out in the classroom. So excited to share both kind of some of the things that I did in my previous role, which you'll actually see some examples of in the presentation, and also what I've learned from leaders that I work with across the country.
Thanks, Matt. And just want to extend a thank you to you as well. And for everyone watching, I think selfishly, I was extremely excited and thankful that Matt's joining us during our prep calls. Each time he talked, I was like, oh, I didn't think about that. Or, oh, I learned something new. And so I hope that many of you have a very similar experience here. I think we are all going to benefit, Matt, from your expertise. So thanks again. So let's get into it. Our session today, as we mentioned, is called Building Belonging. And this, maybe now more than ever, has a very profound impact and effect in terms of how teachers and students approach school each day. And really, as we think about, as I mentioned before, on the evolution, specifically over the last 4 years, but even now, what's happening in current time is that teachers and students and all really stakeholders within a school and district are looking for ways in which belonging makes sense to them. And it is, as we think about the challenges that have both consistently been a part of education, which unfortunately there are quite a few, and then those new ones that have started to pop up, the desire and need for belonging is extremely critical for the success of students and their teachers and support staff, parents, and community members. And so building belonging is something that is extremely important to hear to us here at Screencastify. And I know, Matt, you both personally and Modern Classrooms thinks about building belonging as well. Why don't you tell us a little bit, kind of just your perspective on this topic, and then we'll kind of jump into our subtopics and questions for today.
Yeah, so I'm going to start with a bit of my perspective from my time as a school leader first, because I think for those of you that are school and district leaders on this call, you'll know that this topic is incredibly important, as Shaun was just laying out. I'll argue actually that I think there is sort of almost an endless set of consequences for schools, both positive and negative, to either having relationships of trust that engender belonging with your families and your students, or relationships that may lack that trust and cause consequences that are negative. Actually wrote down one thing from a book I really love, Trust in Schools, Anthony Brick. If you've ever read or seen this book, I think it's really valuable to think about relationship building with, particularly with families and how to engage families. I wrote down a quote I wanted to share because I think it was really good context for this whole conversation. It's, without relational trust, reforms rarely succeed. Trust creates a context where risk is safer, collaboration is deeper, and accountability is shared. Risk is safer, collaboration is deeper, accountability is shared. I think it's just like a really interesting framework. This book also goes on to lay out a case that schools with higher levels of relational trust have higher student achievement. A pretty straightforward connection that I think is worth thinking about. I would offer you to also think a bit about the negative consequence side of that, right? We live in an environment of a high amount of school choice, an environment where parents feel very empowered to kind of assert their rights in schools and classrooms. And having low trust and a lack of belonging can be a real challenge. So as we walk through the conversation today, we're going to kind of weave through some examples of ways that, like we talk about, you can bridge digital tools, in-person communications to build that belonging in your school.
Thanks, Matt. I think that's a perfect kind of intro and dive into where the conversation is going to start. And that's really meeting communities where they are. And I think Matt's kind of intro in terms of both the positive and negative implications of those endless consequences is really where the conversation starts, is that in order to be intentional and thoughtful about how we are engaging the different communities from their starting point is crucial to them kind of feeling welcome and able to engage within that belonging component. And that is true in both schools and districts and kind of wider communities. And so I think this is, again, a good starting point. And so, Matt, would love to pose the first question over to you in terms of when we think about challenges that families face when accessing digital communication, how can we bridge those gaps to ensure full participation? And I think to provide a bit of context on this question, it's that we know that the access, or I should say the need to access digital tools has increased dramatically over the last few years. And so when we don't, in some cases, have that access, it can create unintended consequences. And so I think I'd be curious to hear from your perspective, what challenges do you see in your work, both currently and previously, that families face? And then what can we do about that to kind of fix that and bring some solutions to the table?
Yeah, I'll share first kind of a frame, an analogy. And I think I heard someone say this to me once. I thought it was really valuable. When you send your kid off to school, it's like saying you went and saw a play, but all you have was the ticket stub and what your students said about the play because they went and saw it. You don't have anything else. You've got kind of little pieces of paper that come home and then an account that comes from your student, right? So there's this gap that naturally exists, sort of a black box of communication that parents experience every day when they go to school. Now, the obvious thing to say, right, is to say, okay, well, let's send home some more stuff and let's kind of supplement that with some digital tools. And yes, you should do that because parents are definitely wanting to receive both physical paper and digital communications. There's some challenges, though, that are obvious, I think, when you start to think about them, that parents are facing. First, we don't always know where to find parents. They're not always checking their email. They're not always listening to the same stations, looking at the same social media apps. So we're trying to bridge that gap. The first challenge is like knowing where our audiences are and being able to find ways to meet them. The second is that you've got a lot of folks, there's a challenge of scale often across a school. Even a small school in a lot of cases has 300 families or so potentially. Many have more. Some of you might be from schools that have thousands of students in your school. And so the kind of scale of that communication can be really daunting, particularly when you try to understand like, oh, maybe I sent out a newsletter that had a 20% open rate, but I don't even know which 20% of the thousand that is. And so I need to really start thinking about how do I target folks in groups as opposed to, I'm going to assume that I'm going to send out one broadcast communication and that is going to reach everyone. Again, these are places where digital tools can be really, really helpful in order to bridging some of those gaps. I'll just give you kind of one example is a pretty basic one. When you film something, you film yourself talking about something that's going on in your school as a school leader, that can be used across a variety of platforms. You can put it in a newsletter, put it online in your social media accounts. If you have X or Twitter, or if you have Instagram, any of those things, you can use that in a lot of different contexts. So that's just kind of a quick example. I think, Shaun, you've probably seen some of these examples play out too, of ways that you can bridge those gaps.
Definitely. I think that was a really good lead in terms of the strategies that we can utilize to make that information accessible, because it's very similar to what you were just saying. It's like we want, especially at Screencastify, when we work with our teachers, those that are both new to Screencastify and those that are using for a very long time, we encourage the renewable, reusable component. And while that applies to instructional videos, it certainly applies to communication-based videos. And so we have seen an exponential increase in the way in which educators, district folks are utilizing video to engage their communities. And to your point, they're putting it across a variety of mediums. They're putting it on their district website. They're putting it on their teacher homepages, Classroom, Schoology, Canvas, in emails. There's a whole range of ways that when an intro video, for example, with a teacher is the example I give in a lot of our PD sessions, is that most teachers are going to be introducing themselves at a variety of points throughout the school year. Even if you are a second grade classroom teacher, you are still going to be introducing yourself to new students, to new families. If you have a club that starts in December, if you do a special activity in March, by having a singular intro video, just as a very basic example, that's both going to save you time, but it also really draws a lot of that personal connection to the people whom are watching it. And Matt, I'd love for you to kind of layer onto that in terms of the strategies that you've used both as a school leader and now. What have you seen in terms of ways that we can employ to ensure that information is accessible and also with the consideration of technology and digital access?
Yeah, so first thing is I would say use a variety, and I think I have some examples of this on the next slide, so you'll see them in just a second. In fact, Sean, if you want to jump to them, we can.
Yeah, definitely.
I would say, first thing I would say is use kind of a hybrid model of thinking when you're thinking about meeting people where they are. So some of this stuff's going to happen via digital communication, some of it's going to happen in person. Some of those mediums are going to be video, like we've talked at length about here already. Some of them, though, might be audio. We have an example on here. We started a podcast for our school. And we just like sent it out in different forms. We texted the link out, we put it on platforms, we did different ways to get it out. And we thought about that as a way to just put another medium on there, but also to kind of put a different kind of medium that could share other types of communications, that could highlight students and teachers talking about key projects, stuff that you might not send out in a short, concise newsletter that's more appropriate for an email communication, because there's going to be different types of mediums you're going to want to use, and they're going to require different lengths, kind of different ways of storytelling that you're going to want to think about based on that audience. The other is that we used a lot of kind of standard, like you were saying, Sean, we built some standard tools, applications that were available, for example, like digital tours that we just built into a Google site. So it existed, there were videos on there were resources you could click and link. You didn't need to wait for me as the school leader to be available to give you a tour. You didn't need to come into our school, although you could. There was different ways for folks to engage. So again, meeting people where they are, giving them not just the space that they're in, the medium, whether it's social media, digital, in person, but also the time that they want to receive this information, because they're not always receiving the information when you want to be available to talk about it. So I think that's another big key. And then the last thing I'll say here is this should be a two-way conversation. No communication, no conversation that builds trust and belonging is one way. That's true in our personal lives. It's true in our professional lives. And so as much as possible, really be thinking about, is there a feedback form that I can put on this? Is there a survey question that I could ask? Maybe it's not even a survey, because parents, they're not going to want to take a survey with every communication you send out. Certainly, I wouldn't advise that to anyone. But what I would say is add a question that they can give feedback on. I had a bank that I would just leave open for Q&A. That was it was attached to everything I ever did. There was a quick one question. Do you have a question for me? Right? And parents could submit that. It would pop up in my email and I would know to call them, to pick up the phone, to send them an email back, to see them at the bus stop the next day and just pull them aside and say, hey, I saw you submitted a question for me. I wanted to give you the answer. Right? That is how you create this sort of two-way communication that creates belonging in your school community.
I love that last few things you said, Matt, in terms of, to jump back a bit, in terms of, like you mentioned about people, in terms of when the communication is being delivered. There's a reality that a lot of the families that we are working with and supporting, and the folks that are on the call, are different times. They have different responsibilities, whether it's after school and before school and during the evening and during the night. And so by having this information readily available, it does really increase the amount of exposure and access and ways in which people can kind of approach that information. And to your last point about the kind of survey and or response piece, that's where we've seen a lot of successful districts include our Screencastify submit links at the conclusion of much of the information that you're talking about, in terms of whether it's from like a superintendent to the community, a principal to their staff, a teacher to the parents, just a quick submit link. And they're getting such authentic responses from parents, because sometimes either typing or writing or calling isn't always work, but by submitting a video of yourself, there is a real authenticity to the way in which that relationship continues to develop, and to your point, on the two-way street. And so I think that's just, it's such a strong message, and a really good kind of segue into, those are great ideas, but there are certain kind of things that we also should be aware of that could potentially not always work well, or that we want to kind of try and think through a little bit in terms of proactive reflection. So, from your experience in terms of school leader again and your work with MCP, what common pitfalls do exist in community building? And I think where we'll start is that how do schools, in your opinion, strike a balance between digital and in-person communication? You already kind of think started to touch on this just a bit ago, but we don't want to always rely too heavily on the other. But Matt, talking a little about what you've seen that strikes a good solid balance and what it takes to do that.
Yeah, there's sort of two sides to this. One is, I think post-pandemic, we've all tried to take a step back from being so digital with everything we do. We want to be in person when we can, and I think we sometimes withdraw from digital spaces. I think that's a challenge. But I think on reverse sometimes can be the bigger challenge, right? If I'm sending things out via email and that's my primary method of reaching people, that is just not going to reach who you need to reach the most. It may reach those families that really are going to keep up on everything, but they're going to do it no matter where you put it. They're going to do it if you send home a piece of paper. They're going to do it if you put out a newsletter. Whatever way you communicate, those families are going to be the ones that do look at it. You want to know, how do I reach the folks that are not? I also would say here, a strategy that I've seen really work is going out to places where folks are to kind of connect this back to the meet people where they are a bit, but also using a QR code, using something where people can see you out of space, grab their phone out, quickly engage with something you want to get them digitally when you're seeing them in person. So that there's kind of that link that you can constantly create between hey, I saw you at the farmer's market on Sunday, or hey, we were walking around this fair that happened on a Saturday morning, and I was able to give you this quick thing, that quick note, quick QR code, quick place to go that you can go and access more information, so that when you're ready to do that, I think that's great. So first is the not falling prey to either kind of falling away too heavily. And the second is mixing them in a way that, again, meets people where they are, I think is really critical.
I'm such a fan that you were talking about the in-person component, both in the real life out examples, but also mixing the balance between the two. Because I think one of the mentions that you made about people pulling back, especially post-pandemic, is that there is nothing that can replace the teacher-student relationship, especially. And the more we can cultivate that in person, the better off everyone's going to be, including the students and the parents, families, and adults at home that are supporting those students. And so the ways that we can merge and kind of marry those two things, I think that the more success we see with accomplishing that idea of the students and families feeling that sense of belonging. But in your opinion, Matt, kind of to continue to build on that, when we think about consistency from those different layers of communication, what role does consistency play in how we're communicating, and how do schools avoid the irregular or sporadic updates? Because we know that teachers have the best intentions. We know that district leaders and students and families have the best intentions, but it's hard to be consistent all the time. And so what role do we play with that consistency?
Yeah, I'll share the first bit, and I think most of us have been school administrators, I think know some version of this, but I think it's a good helpful reminder, which is kind of a basic truth, is that if the first time or second time I receive news from you, it's something bad about my student, I probably am going to lose trust. That's a trust withdrawal, right? Belonging is not going to happen in an environment where you mostly receive bad news first. And so first, I'll just note, I think a reminder to all of us that maintaining that regular, consistent cadence of communication deposits trust into the bank of relationships with families in a way that allows you to share bad news when it's needed, in a way that allows you to push people and hold people accountable. The other thing I'll say on this is I think I would invite us all to think about your favorite TV show. Do you need a calendar invite to go watch it? Probably not, right? Because you know what time it airs. I watch Survivor. It comes on at 8 o'clock on Wednesday, every Wednesday for 20 years. And so I never need a reminder to watch Survivor because I know how consistent it has been as a show. And so I'll just say, the truth, that is true for our communications too. And this is hard. I was a principal, I was an assistant principal. I spent, 6 years sending out newsletters to families. And I sometimes messed up and I didn't get it out on the last Friday of the month that I said I was going to send it out every month. And when that doesn't happen, I think it does break down the ability of folks to stay up to date on what you're doing. Parents are extremely busy. Many of you are probably parents. You're not going to be, setting your calendar all the time to remember every last thing you need to do with school. You need to know that your school community is going to be there to touch base with you on a consistent basis. And the last thing I'll say is be consistent too in the mediums you use. So look across all your mediums. Am I consistently communicating on each of them at a cadence that is matching what I know about engagement for my families? So just don't rely on the email newsletter goes out on the last Friday of the month. Do that. Make sure you don't mess up on that. But also don't forget to make sure that your staff call or your family call that you put out goes out at the same time every week or every month. Don't forget about those posts on Instagram. Do you get them out once a week or so? Maybe even a little more than that if you can. Those are all good things to monitor and check on.
Such kind of essential advice, I think, when we think about how we can plan proactively. And I think, Matt, you mentioned too, like how that consistency allows for the communication of honest feedback sometimes when it's not always maybe the most positive, but by having that consistent cadence, it does allow for the trust to be maintained. And speaking personally, like I know that my second grader gets their newsletter Friday afternoons. I get my fourth grade newsletter Sunday evenings. And it is like clockwork. And we are blessed with two wonderful teachers. And my 7-year-old with ADHD doesn't always make the best choices. But when I get the emails from his teacher, there is that trust that I have with her because there is that consistent communication. And so that is just one very, very small example, but it really is true. And I think as that kind of comes into how can we think about actions in practical, tangible environments. And so Matt touched on several of these already. And there's a few layers, though, to the regular cadence of announcements that Matt touched on, is whether you're sending an email or a Screencastify video, stuff like setting little reminders for yourself or having it be on the exact same time of the exact same week every single time allows folks to feel that consistency. And so again, speaking from the assistant principal and department chair, it's like every Friday afternoon that email has to get out. Like there's that weight on you that it should be, because that is deserved amongst the audience who is going to be receiving it. And so I think that while sharing that also then can, as we've expanded our tech tools, be placed in a variety of communication channels beyond our school and within our school. And so I think each of these do represent ways in which we can consistently try to engage folks in a variety of ways. And it does then kind of continue to build on how we integrate both of those ways. And so we spoke a little bit about why it's important for there to be the balance, but there really is a kind of reality to making sure that those two things can coexist with digital and in-person communication. Matt, when you think about schools and the most successful ones you've seen that have created a kind of hybrid model about integrating digital and in-person communication, what ways have you seen that have kind of generated the maximum level of impact by doing those things simultaneously?
Yeah. So first, I'll just say I was with a school out in Clark County recently. They have a really powerful school community. They have a really powerful school leader who communicates very well. And I just want to emphasize, not all of your communication has to be super complex and super structured in order to be really, really useful. He actually pulled me aside and had me really quickly film a 30-second video with him about the work we were doing in the school to let parents in on it. And he actually sent another version. He me filmed two versions, one for parents, one for students that he sent out in the student announcements that students even could be in on. Hey, here's what we're doing at our school. Here's the ways we're experimenting and tinkering with these elements of mastery-based learning. And, I thought what a powerful way to kind of supplement the traditional communications you're sending out, bringing in someone who's part of your school community that parents would never know about. Like they're never going to see me. They're never going to know about the work that I'm doing in this community with the school leader unless it's, reaching them some other way. So I think just it's an example again of it doesn't always have to be super complicated. It can be very simple. I'll work up though to a bit more complicated approach. And I'll actually use an example that I think applies to a lot of things, and just give me a second to play it out. So when I was in district central office in Durham Public Schools, a team that I was leading was tasked with building a survey for families that was gathering some really key information that was going to help us determine busing routes, was going to help us think about how our schools were engaging with families based on the way they wanted to be engaged with in schools. So this was information we needed. It was like kind of a one time in a few years type of survey. And we were hatching a plan to get it out. And like you all can think about what response rate do you get when you send out a survey to your parents? 20, 30%. We had a 92% response rate of 30,000 students.
Wow.
And there were no gaps between race and ethnicity grounds between who participated in our survey. None at all.
Wow.
And I'll tell you what we did. This was what we did that was really powerful. First, we really thought about some Covey practices around execution. If you've ever read The Four Disciplines of Execution, if you've not, please read it. It's essential for school leaders. But the first thing we did was like we created a really cool scoreboard that distributed leadership to different folks within our community for ensuring that they were tracking who was filling out their surveys. It actually went by kid, whether their parent had filled out a survey, and then aggregated that up to a district-wide and school-wide percentage of who had completed it. Now that's fun and like cool and everything, but if I send that out once, we're not going to get a 92% response rate. People will check it like once every 2 weeks, and then that'll be all that they do. We'll get 30% just like we would if we sent the link out on some website or email. What we did then was we paired that with team-based approaches that met people in multiple different avenues. We canvassed phone calls. We went in person to the local basketball games and had a QR code sitting at a table. We sat out at different places around town where we knew folks would be going on the weekends. And we combined that in-person approach, the phone approach, the digital approach, and sending things out with that data system that allowed us to really see the bigger picture, see the scoreboard, and go person by person, almost in a canvassing style, to get the communication out that we wanted to share. I share that example because it's a big project. It's not something you're going to replicate with every communication you get out in your school. But I shared that example to think about a few things. One, how can you create a scoreboard that helps you track how you're communicating in different methods and mediums and who is engaging with that communication? Two, how can you distribute leadership across your teams? So you're creating communication templates, different tools you're sharing. You might share a little clip on like, here's how to record this Screencastify video and send it out to a family when you might want to do that. And give folks the ability to be empowered within their role as an educator, as a community support specialist, as a counselor, to continuously ping those different communications. You might put them all on a calendar so everyone knows who's communicating during what times. So there's a really clear cadence. Again, that's kind of bringing it all together in the sense that you're going to combine all of these different mediums. You're going to put them in a way that makes sense for the user, not for you. And you're going to try to do it person by person so that you know who's responding and who's not responding.
I think that very clear explanation and step-by-step process highlights how not only is it essential to consistently engage, but all the school leaders and teachers who are listening, which is most of you, we don't need to tell you, like, it's hard to engage all of your families and all of your adults. And so you all already work tirelessly to do that. And I think, Matt, to your point, when we think about how we can take something that we're doing already and then repurposing and repackaging it without a lot of extra time is where we start to find that nice hybrid balance. And so to your point about Screencastify, I think back to like a month or so ago, we had a back to school meet the teacher night, and the principal did a really, really solid 20-minute intro. But as you look around, not every parent is able, or not every adult is able to come attend that. And so by recording that 20-minute intro, it's already being said, but we're just now creating an artifact and an example of that piece of media that we can then go share out in a variety of different ways. And with the technology that Screencastify offers is that it doesn't take that much more time once you've already done the work, which people are doing already. And so I think it's, to your point, thinking about ways in which, without a ton of additional time expenditure, how are we going to get more from that? And so I love what you said. And I think curious from your perspective, as you think through that, and you kind of already started to get there, what are some examples that you've seen of like hybrid communication strategies where schools have been able to maintain those strong community connections?
Yeah, I'm actually going to give an example that highlights one other lesson that I think I forgot to share first, which is make it fun. Build a brand, make it fun, make it something that people can lean in on and be like, oh, this is cool. And here's the example. We had half days in our district. And kind of during the pandemic, we piloted this thing that we then kept afterwards because we thought it was really cool that on these Wednesday half days that are professional learning days where we just like send the kids out at 12:45 after rushing them through school all day and we didn't know what even happened and they're on the bus and they're gone. We actually decided to use that time to make it what we called Wellness Wednesday. And so we would send out a playlist of resources to parents every Wednesday when their kids left home early. We'd say, hey, we know you got your kids for an extra couple hours. Do something to make your family well. And we would engage in some of that stuff with them. And on the playlist was stuff that happened virtually live, stuff that could be done asynchronously when parents wanted to do it with their kids, and even stuff that happened in person. We had a frisbee club, ultimate frisbee club, where families would come and connect, and that would happen right after school, but it was part of the Wellness Wednesday playlist. We made it part of this fun brand. So it created sort of this cool connection that happened between the Wellness Wednesday brand and our families, and people would start to really engage with it over time. They were like, "Oh, look what we're doing," and we would give them an opportunity to communicate back with us through social media. They would share their Wellness Wednesday videos on on our Twitter account or send them to us, and we would post them. So it was a really just one example, but I think it highlights one of the other things that I didn't mention at all up to this point, which is, try to find ways to make these communication streams fun so that people want to engage with them.
And you said it before, and you did both your examples just it's a two-way communication strategy. Is that the more likely that parents are empowered and able to send their communication and their thoughts and their feedback, the more likely it is that they do find that sense of belonging. And that's kind of something that just piqued my interest as you said that.
Yeah. Two other quick things that are about this two-way communication and successful hybrid communication approaches. Think too about how you can kind of integrate this way of thinking about communicating and building belonging with your families into the way that you really structure your school improvement processes and you're thinking about how to work in your school. I'll give you two really good examples. Dr. Karen Mapp has some work that's based out of Harvard. And it's all about this kind of dual capacity model of family engagement. We can share this in the notes afterwards because I did not pre-work put it in the slides. But Dr. Karen Mapp has a really good, it's called the dual capacity model for family engagement. And it's all about helping parents be co-creators in your community. It's really a high level way of thinking about all the stuff that you do that might engage families. Maybe it already does, maybe it doesn't yet, but how could you do it better to ensure that parents are co-creators in the school environment? So that's one. The other is community schools. If you've ever heard of like a community schools approach, you can just Google community schools and a ton of stuff about it will come up. But one of the things that they do is they create these sort of parent, student, community school liaison teams that are in charge of building this two-way relationship. And families actually get to come in, not just to say, like, let me tell you about what's going on with my student, but let me give you feedback on how I think our school should function and audit systems and give you more advice on how parents are seeing certain things. So I think that's just another good example of like, how can you kind of take a systemic view too, in addition to the sort of day by day cadence of communication that we know needs to happen for parents.
Most definitely. And I think that that's a kind of consistent into these examples that you were just kind of speaking to. But that idea of the communication piece, Matt, what are we looking at here that kind of builds on some of the things that you were just saying?
Yeah, this is stuff I already shared. So I think we can like let folks look at this in the show notes. So the Wellness Wednesday playlist is actually pictured here. And then on the right is just an example of some video communication that I used to use regularly as part of our newsletter modeling engagement. Oh, I will say one other thing here. We talked a lot about parents. What about staff? How can we
Totally.
use these tools to engage our staff too? I will say, if you've never done self-paced staff meeting that utilizes some in-person and some hybrid tools, try it. Email me after this and I'll send you some templates for how to do it. But like your staff will never be happier than when you say, hey, we're going to give you some time back by doing a self-paced hybrid model for our staff meeting that you can do partially at home and get home early, right? What a great way to model the practice and also give your staff something that they'll value, which is time.
Matt, I don't know about you, but I am confident that 100% of every staff member that I sent a Friday email to read every one of those emails
Right,
in
of
their
course, of course. Of course, everyone always reads all of our emails.
totally. And I think that that's a good segue into the staff and parent and adult and student piece of making the community of a school more accessible. And so when we think about specifically the tools and services that we can consider and utilize, both from a language perspective for accessibility, but also the way in which we're considering how we know that non-native English speakers are increasing. We know that districts have more languages within their schools than ever before. And so it's extremely top of mind for a lot of the folks that we talk to. Matt, from your perspective, when you think about tools and services for translation, how do you consider that? What do you do kind of when you're thinking through this with partner districts?
Yeah, this is great. So first, you can translate things at a level that was not possible when I was a school leader 5 years ago, right? There is a lot that you can do now. There's things like talking points is obviously one that a lot of people know. You can use Screencastify tools to translate your videos, which I think Shaun will probably talk about in a second. I won't steal your thunder there. There's also things like Flex Clip, which I've seen used. There's all sorts of different tools that are out there. Use the one that works for you. Think about the ways that you can leverage it. What I will say are kind of the best practices is this is a place where it is extra important that you at least once a year you canvass every family somehow. Like ensure that every homeroom teacher is calling everyone and getting the answers to the questions of like, how do you best like to be communicated with? In what language? When do you best like to be communicated with? So that stuff, I will say, like doing that once a year or twice a year in a Canvas format where it's like the census, we're going to every door and we're getting everybody is critical because your student information system, I probably don't need to tell you this, is out of date, right? It doesn't have the things you probably need. And I worked in a school, I'll just go way back. I worked in a school when I was a teacher where like 90% of my student information system was out of date. I had to find a cousin to get a phone number, to call an aunt to get another phone number to find out where I was going. And so like that doing that canvas teacher by teacher to ensure that every student you have updated information for is going to help all of this other stuff be more effective because when you translate something, you want to make sure it's getting to people in a format that they actually are paying attention to because you're not going to be able to translate every single thing that you do all the time. Now, you're more able to do it now because of AI, but you want to make sure that that's kind of first and foremost. The second is just like think about places that you're not making accessible right now that you can in terms of translation and how you can get the word out to those folks that things will be translated because your families that need that do not assume that it's going to be translated. And often they'll just withdraw themselves because they don't assume that you're doing it. So like put it at the top of the flyer, make sure it's in everything you send that like this event or this opportunity is going to be translated.
Key kind of takeaways there from what you just mentioned in terms of like the canvassing piece is that so often we know that adults and parents and families want to help, they want to support, they want to engage. But if it's not able or if they're not they don't have the time or if they don't know English, those can be real barriers. But now and to your point, Matt, we have the ability to solve a lot of those challenges. And so by doing so, it does really encourage those folks to be more engaged. And by us having the idea behind translation and the way and time that they want to be communicated with can be so critical in terms of getting those folks engaged and being a sense of belonging within the school. And so, and this is, I think, again, kind of what you were just getting at is that how can we solicit input from underrepresented or non native English speaking families to make sure their voices are heard?
Yeah, I'll add on to this here. I mentioned a couple things that I think are really good. Like when you're doing that canvas, ensure that you are noting those non-native English speakers and noting what they're saying about the processes of communication. I think another thing that I would say is drill down another level and look at the different parts of your school community that they're engaging with and ask them questions about those. Because you may find things that you didn't even know about, like, hey, there is so much school jargon and so many acronyms in the student intervention process that like my kids that are in MTSS are being referred for special education, their parents that don't speak English have no idea what's going on. Right. And if that's the case, that's a big problem. Like you want to fix that. And so, like, don't forget to ask specific questions where you can, especially when you're in a space. This is where it's a great example of integrating the in-person and virtual. When you're in a space with parents where you have a translator, like let's say they're coming for one of those intervention meetings or something's going on, don't forget to ask and gather and know where to put that information so that when you're then communicating later in a virtual setting, you have the things that you need to do that. To me, a big chunk of accessibility is really having the right communication infrastructure in terms of tools for translation, teams of people that can really do this, and the data that's up to date to be able to do it well. To me, that's super critical. And again, here, creating spaces too, where one other thing I'll say here, creating spaces where the Spanish language or the other language that's primarily in your school, for some of you, it might be French, it might be Arabic, there are others, where that language, if you have a dominant non-English language, is prioritized first, is another key thing. So, and again, you can do that in a virtual setting, which is really cool. Don't forget the value of like, hey, let's try to do a town hall that's just in Spanish in addition to the one that's in English. If you've got a lot of Spanish speakers in your building, that can be really, really powerful. And you can just get a translator for those couple times, record it, make sure people know that they have the opportunity to give input.
I think that's all so critical. And I think it's a great build into when we think about Screencastify and putting some of those ideas, especially from the digital video format, with how communication is shared so frequently. Screencastify now, as many of you probably know, has significant world language translation, transcript, and voice overlay capabilities. And so, as Matt had mentioned, once you have the data in place and you understand what's possible, teachers are already doing the work. And so you're already making the videos, there's already being shared out. But now more than ever, when those videos are shared via Screencastify, we offer users and viewers the ability and option to actually choose the language of their choice that these videos are translated to, that the transcripts are translated to, and then the voice overlay from an AI speaking perspective provides that voiceover in the language of their choice. And so when we have these families that desperately do want to help and be engaged with, they now can do that via video, especially. And so as video consistently grows in terms of communication capabilities, all within Screencastify, specifically in the CC button, in the transcript on the right, and then on your voice overlay option, parents from 90 different languages that is consistently just growing from the list of available choices will be able to pick the language that is most suitable for them. And so, as an example, if I was a fourth grade teacher with 30 different students in my class, if 30 of those students spoke 30 different languages at home, if I sent a video home to all 30 of those students, those 30 different families could pick 30 different languages of their choosing on that same video. And so it's something that we take seriously, very much so from the accessibility standpoint for the reasons that Matt mentioned. And so I think this is something, Matt, that we've talked about. Not sure if you want to layer on anything here, but would love to get your take on that too.
Yeah, actually, we'll layer on a little bit, which is just to say we work with a school that's one of our kind of demonstration schools that we really bring people to see that's in Chicago, where there are 40 different languages spoken across the school in a lot of different settings. Many classrooms, there's not a primary language other than English. And so, but there are tons of speakers whose families do not speak English at home, and they are really leveraging the elements of video instruction to help parents engage with students in terms of homework and helping them move toward the learning outcomes that they have. So I think that's just, again, this is another opportunity. If you've got a video that a teacher records, like a blended learning environment, a flipped learning environment, if you're in a full modern classroom environment, they can take that and translate it using this tool. And not only is it helping the student who might speak another English as, or another language as their first language, it's also helping the parent now be engaged. Because I can tell you this, that parent would love to go over the array formula for multiplication at home with their student if they're struggling, but they can't right now because it's in English or it's not being sent home at all.
I'm so glad you added that on. It is absolutely for the student and the parent and the family at home to be able to engage. It's such a good addition. And that actually brings us to our fifth and final topic, school choice and family engagement, something, Matt, that I know you're passionate about, that we've talked a lot about. Thinking through how belonging is so important with all the stuff we've talked about thus far, kind of culminating with this last kind of two question segment here. How can schools build trust and transparency with families when school choice can create competition for resources and enrollment?
Yeah, this is a huge topic, huge topic. So I'll say first, we all know that school choice is a reality that's here to stay, and it's going to get more and more competitive in many of our environments if it's not already. I come from a district where a huge chunk of something like 30% of students that were school age did not attend the public school system. So in that world, everyone has kind of a challenge, right? You've got charter schools that are competing with each other for students. You've got public schools that are competing to keep their students enrolled in their base school. And it really requires you to build this relationship of trust. First, I will say digital tools are a huge way to do that. If families can access videos of your teachers talking about the amazing things that they're doing, videos of your students seeing outcomes that are really positive, videos of your school so they can imagine their child walking through the halls, sitting in the lunchroom, going to the media center and checking out a book. It's way more likely that they're going to create a relationship with your school that helps them make that final decision to be the customer that buys the product that you're selling. And I hate to use that frame often, but like I'm using it here to say like it's a reality when it comes to school choice. So, think about how you can leverage all this rich environment of video and digital communication to create on-demand resources that parents can access and see and communicate with you. That can also include live resources. Go to where parents are physically, but also give them options to engage digitally. Sometimes parents are going to be in the car and they're going to want to pull something up and listen to it, right? Like these are all things that you can do, I think, to build that relationship that helps parents ultimately choose your school and say, this is something I want to do. I'll just underline, we learned this in a really powerful way when I was opening our hybrid school in Durham. We found was a big target was we wanted to get homeschool families to come for a part of the day so we could count those families on our enrollment and help our budget. You all are probably in environments where enrollment equals budget. And if you don't have students in seats, like you're not going to have the funding to fund the programs you want to fund. And so we said, how can we talk to homeschool families in a way that meets their needs and helps them understand? We created a ton of on-demand resources, like I just said. One other thing we did was we learned that homeschoolers were a surprisingly large part of our county, almost 3,000 students. And
Wow.
in our state, and most other states, by the way, their addresses are public record because they're schools. They're registered as schools. So we found the addresses. We sent a really nice mailer with a QR code that said, hey, come learn about us. And you would be shocked how many people engaged with that. We had like 400 clicks on that QR code. We had
Wow.
120 homeschool students come part-time to our school. Multiply that by the per pupil number for the state and think about how valuable that one mailer was for us. I mean, I'm talking millions of dollars. So just to kind of note here that be out, be proactive, be present, and use on-demand resources in a space to compete for school choice.
That is brilliant. And I think our marketing folks listening to this, Matt, might give you a call and try to find out some of the tips and tricks you got on those metrics.
Yeah.
But lastly, thinking about that because it is so sincerely important about getting out in front of them and thinking about the ways to engage not only for school choice, but even for those that are in a certain school, whether it's a neighborhood school or kind of the school that they are registered and sent to, it's that there needs to be that same sense of trust and transparency. And as we've prepped and kind of had our conversation today, I know that it's important to you for any student and family in any environment for them to think about how they're addressing the challenges in complex communication. We know that information and sharing and dispersing that is challenging, especially when it comes to school choice and or the academic programs and enrollment policies. And I think too, to even build onto this, when you think about financial literacy and when you get into high school and post high school type options, all of these are critical things that we can communicate. And so how are schools addressing these challenges?
First, I'll say, let's do another webinar and let's talk all about this because this is really, really important. Yeah, I'll just say a couple things. First is like, I would find a way to visually represent some of the key things that parents need to know about your school in a way that's like one click. You cannot have parents going to your website, going to the menu for this, and then scrolling down the 8 million things that are underneath the menu for that and not finding what that, and then going to another menu and then having to click on a page on that menu and then having to scroll down halfway through to find it. The parents that need that information, the ones that are choosing between your school and something else, if you're going to have a competitive advantage, if they can get to that stuff quicker. Think about how do I create a visual hub that's like new to our school, go here. Bing, 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 all the things you need to know. Quick policies, visuals, like a homepage, like a dashboard, however you want to think about it. I've seen schools use this really, really effectively. Um, Again, I would also share video as much as you can here, not to kind of do your job for you, Shaun, to pitch, but like use video instruction to show people in a short fashion. People are used to TikTok videos. If they can find out something in the time it would take them to scroll up on their phone, like that's really powerful. 10, 20, 30-second videos, quickly telling them how to do something and then giving them a follow-up step that they can go do right away. Those things are really, really critical. One last thing I'll say, and I know we got to go. The people underestimate the power of those communications being culturally responsive. We sometimes assume, especially in the school choice environment, like I'll just say it bluntly, like we sometimes assume like who our customers are. And that's not true. Like we live in a country that is extremely diverse, where people are choosing their schools for all kinds of different reasons. I worked in a community that was like roughly a third, a third, a third by racial ethnicity, a ton of different languages being spoken, high diversity in socioeconomic needs. And there was not a single part of that group of and diversity of people in our community that weren't thinking about choosing schools for their children. So if you want to be out ahead of that, think about ways you can be culture responsive with where, how, and when you're communicating, because that's going to be critical to achieving the results you want to achieve.
I think that that is a great note to bring us home to these ideas in action. Thinking through about being proactive before day one, and you just hit on it in terms of being not only culturally responsive, but thinking through how you are seeking out those families and those parents. And again, this is true for school choice and also for before the start of the school year. You know, if your first grader is going to a school, how nice is it to get that proactive communication postcard from their teacher or from the school before school starts? And so these little ideas that you add a QR code into Matt's point about video, you add a QR code to said postcard that shows up at your door, and then you scan the QR code and there's the teacher welcoming your student to the school year or to a new school or the thinking about a new school. Each of these layers of communication in terms of thinking through how we're bridging those gaps and offering different ways in which these folks can engage is so important. We were trying, Matt and I desperately were trying to end on time
We really
to give
were.
us to give us time for questions, but we are already 7 minutes over. So what Matt and I can commit to is if you have any questions, we know that several of them came in. We will commit to sending out those responses, but we do just want to conclude with a thank you. Matt, would love for you to just send any closing words here before we wrap up.
Y'all hung out if you're on the East Coast till 4:55. It's dark where I am, so thanks for hanging out in a webinar and listening to us.
Same. Completely echo what Matt said. We're in Chicago. It is snowy and almost dark out. So thank you all. We very much appreciate your time. Thanks for being here. If you have any questions, feel free to send us an email. Let us know. You can find Matt and I in a variety of places. But thanks again. Have a great rest of your day, and we will see you soon. Thanks, everyone.